Okay, I'm going to call it here. Let's go ahead and kick off this webinar. Let's go ahead and I'll stop sharing our placeholder just so we can say hello to all of you beautiful people. My name is Marketing Team. Just kidding. My name is Thomas Vidas and I'm with Ionic. And here today we have Abhijeet from Sentry and Nathan from AAA. And we're going to talk about Capacitor and Sentry's new Capacitor SDK that they're working on. And we're going to talk about how AAA is using that in their production applications. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so we can go through our slide deck and we're going to get this kicked off. So first and foremost, let's go over the agenda of what we're going to talk about. We're going to go over more formal introductions where I'm going to give Abhijeet and Nathan a chance to introduce themselves very briefly. We're going to talk about using Capacitor, and then we're going to talk about using the Sentry SDK. And then we're going to talk about AAA and their joint value and how they're using this today in their production applications. We're going to have a fun, quick demo for you and a real world use case. And then we'll have time at the end for a Q&A session. So we'll be monitoring the chat. And if you have anything, you can pop it in there. And at the end, we'll have time to more formally address exact questions, but feel free to drop them in and then we'll get to them at the end. So let's talk about the presenters. We already gave a quick introduction, but we'll go down the line, starting with myself. I'm Thomas Vidas. I'm the Capacitor Developer Experience Engineer at Ionic, focus on all things Capacitor and post all these webinars. And you'll probably see me on GitHub, Discord, all of the places, the public-facing guy at Ionic working on Capacitor. Love it here. Capacitors are great. We're going to talk a little bit more about it and how you can integrate with it in this webinar today. So let's hand it off to Abhijeet, and so he can give himself a quick introduction.
Hey folks, my name is Abhijeet. I'm a software engineer at Sentry, based out of beautiful Toronto, Canada. At Sentry, I help build out our core JavaScript SDKs and kind of the related ecosystem SDKs related to it, like Node, Browser, Electron, and of course, Capacitor. Super excited to talk to you folks here today about how you can use both Sentry and Capacitor to ship really cool things.
Hi, my name's Nathan. I work for AAA. I'm a senior mobile developer for their app. I'm going to show you guys today how we use Sentry, Ionic, and Capacitor in our mobile app to basically solve some interesting challenges unique to us.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and get things started. Let's talk a little bit about Capacitor. I am assuming that many people here in the webinar today have heard about Ionic and Capacitor, but let's talk about it at a high level for those who haven't. So Ionic kind of encompasses as a whole, the company encompasses a whole application platform. We have open source projects like Ionic Framework, our UI toolkit for making native looking web applications on Android and iOS. We have Capacitor, which is our runtime bridge that allows you to take your web applications and put them as native mobile applications, as well as Ionicons and animations and tons of other great open source projects that Ionic builds. We also have enterprise level plugins, such as biometrics, single sign-on, secure encrypted local storage for our enterprise customers that you can integrate with in your Ionic or Capacitor applications. And we also have a CI/CD platform known as AppFlow, which allows for continuous app updates to the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, as well as live updates that allow you to bypass those updates via the Play Store. We also offer advisory and expert training, but that's Ionic as a whole. Today, we're going to talk about Capacitor specifically and how it integrates with Sentry and how AAA is using it in their production environment. Like I briefly mentioned, Capacitor is our open source MIT licensed platform for building iOS, Android, and PWA applications using web APIs and plugins, which allow you to drill down into the native Android SDK and the iOS SDKs to access features that just aren't available yet in web. You have the power of web APIs and Xcode and Android Studio at your disposal. So like I said before, you can build your web first application and export it to Android and iOS, and you have the power of these underlying platforms to build upon it. It's super powerful. It's super great. and we're going to talk about Sentry and Capacitor and what they are doing to support our open source ecosystem and how you can use them in your application today. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Abhijeet so he can control my slides, and we're good to go now.
Thank you. Awesome. So yeah, Sentry, Capacitor, a really great match. But before we continue, why don't we give a brief introduction about what Sentry is? Sentry is a developer tool built for developers by developers, and it helps you monitor the health of your applications. Our kind of core thing that we're really well known for is our error and crash monitoring. You can install one of our SDKs, in this case, npm install at Sentry/Capacitor for your Capacitor app, and start getting errors and crashes that are happening in your application. More recently now, we also do performance monitoring, allowing you to see kind of what screen loads are slow and try to figure out why that's happening. Alongside this, with both error monitoring and performance monitoring, we also allow you to monitor the health of your releases in general. So you can see that after you deploy a change, if you can make sure that your users are not crashing or not experiencing any errors. To dig in further to try to figure out what devices are most affected or what users are most affected, we also have tools like Discover. Think of like a BI tool to help you find out and dig into what exactly is causing the issues in your application. In addition, Sentry has a ton of kind of things in our ecosystem you can integrate with other platforms like Jira, Slack, GitHub, whatever your workflow is, Sentry will be right there for you. And so really the Sentry workflow is that you install our SDK, you instrument your application, you start getting issues that really matter to you, and you dig in, and with some context, we show you the line of code where things are happening. You can attach custom tags. We have a bunch of extra metadata that comes in, try to solve those issues, fix them, and then monitor to see if your fix actually worked. We support over 30 different languages, most of which are kind of first-party SDKs we support, but there are also a ton of community SDKs out there with over kind of 1 million developers using our platform, over 68,000 organizations. So let's dig into the Sentry Capacitor SDK, because we built one for Capacitor as well. So Sentry's Capacitor SDK enables automatic reporting of errors, exceptions, and performance data in your Capacitor apps. The nice thing is, because kind of we have like this great JavaScript layer to work with, it's built on top of our core JavaScript SDKs. And you can even use our framework SDKs like our React SDK or Angular SDK, for example. And that all kind of works out of the box. We also have the Capacitor SDK also wraps Sentry's mobile SDKs for Android and iOS using Capacitor's excellent plugin system. And so that means that you have native crash support out of the box. You install our SDK, and if there's an error or a crash in the iOS layer, for example, that'll get forwarded and reported to Sentry. In addition, just like Capacitor itself, our SDK is also fully open source for you to check out and take a look at. We at Sentry have a really big philosophy. We try to kind of support as many developers as possible. And that if you even take a look at our docs, we support over 100 different platforms and frameworks. And so it was really natural for us to build out a Capacitor SDK and support all of these devs using Capacitor. We initially also have a Cordova SDK that we also maintain, but we're focusing a lot on the Capacitor SDK. There are a ton of orgs using Sentry and Capacitor together, and it has a really high growth rate, over 150% year over year of new organizations creating and using Capacitor and Sentry together. As for us building the SDK in the first place, it was super easy. We could kind of build off of the foundation of our core JavaScript SDKs. So we didn't have to write much extra code, and Capacitor's plugin system gave us basically all we needed to reach into the native layers This is a really different experience than what we had with kind of other cross-platform SDKs with other frameworks and libraries, where this was like way harder. And also, thankfully, Capacitor doesn't really break, which means that when you upgrade new Capacitor versions, the SDK should usually work as normal. The exception to this, of course, is major version bumps, but we do support both Capacitor 2 and 3. In addition, there's a lot of great docs out there for Capacitor, and since it was open source, oftentimes we can just dig right into the code and see what was happening. So we really had a great experience building out our SDK for Capacitor. So going to do a little bit of a live demo, show you kind of how you can add Sentry to your Capacitor app. Just going to use the basic kind of app that's generated from the Ionic CLI. And then actually kind of show off what that looks like in Sentry itself. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully folks are able to see my VS Code. Does that all look good? I'm going to assume looks good.
On my end.
Perfect. So I went ahead and kind of already kind of added the libraries and versions. So we have Capacitor 0.6.1. And then although we do have like a major version for the JavaScript SDKs, we haven't updated Capacitor yet to do that. Actually, the PR for that merged in like 2 days ago, so a release will come out soon. But for now, we're going to install the latest versions of the V6 SDKs. And I'm also going to install Sentry CLI. So actually, we can just run npm install. And while that's going on, let's actually go through and see what we have to add to the application to get Sentry working. So we recommend initializing the Sentry SDK as soon as possible. So in this case, we can just go into the index. Here, I just set up an Ionic application with React, but if you're using Angular or Vue or anything else, it should be very similar. I'm going to go ahead and import Sentry from @Sentry/Capacitor. And I'm also going to go ahead and, as we mentioned, we can make use of our framework SDKs also. So we have kind of our top level mobile SDK with Capacitor. And since we want to see React Insights and get into that too, we can use our SDK from the React side as well. And if you're using Angular or Vue, it'll work the same way, but with @Sentry/Angular or @Sentry/Vue. I'm also going to just kind of paste this in. This is for performance monitoring, which we'll take a look at afterwards. Then we just have to call Sentry.init. Kind of the only real option that you need is a DSN, which helps tell your application and point it toward what Sentry project the error or performance data should be sent to. So here's just a DSN that I generated. And that's pretty much it. One thing that you can then do for further insights is to put in the initialization function of the framework specific Sentry. And that's a super basic Sentry init. And that's really all you need to get started. I'm going to go ahead and add some more traces, sample rate, add some more additional options to get performance monitoring working so that we'll send performance data through. And just to kind of make things easy, I'm going to attach a release and distribution. And so this is so that when we catch an error, because we want to be able to upload source maps related to your project so that you can kind of see the exact line of code where the issue was happening. And let's also then maybe add something where we can kind of show an error, because we basically added Sentry. This is it. Initializing this also initializes the native layers. So the iOS and Android SDKs are automatically set up, again, based on what platform you're deploying on. So perhaps we go into like the tab 1 component and we add, let's say like right here, like I think we can add an ion button. Let's say on click, handle click. And let's just say this is going to be like a click here for JS error. And then up here, we can define handle click. We don't have to use anything with the event handler, but let's just say this throws an error. Oh no. And so then we could try building this application, clicking this this button. It'll throws an error, obviously, in the JavaScript layer, and seeing how that looks like in Sentry. And so we can run a command, and I'm also going to run a command to upload the source map. So we're just going to run this on iOS. I have my iPhone here. It's unfortunately blending into the background, but I'll be running this through Xcode on my phone. And then we'll also be uploading the source maps related to it. So I got a command here. We can see here that the release matches the release that we set alongside the distribution, and that we have like just a URL prefix we set. And so this will run for a bit. Oh, we got to build. And so in this case, again, it's building the web assets, then copying it over so that we can kind of run the build on Xcode. One thing actually, it should be fine. And so aside from the kind of automatic instrumentation that this gives you, you can also kind of set your own custom data or manually capture errors or messages that you think are important to you. So for example, we allow you to kind of set tags. So these are like key value pairs that are associated with Sentry data. And you can also manually capture an exception, for example, so that it's not just things that automatically bubble up to global event handlers, but let's say you try catch something, you can handle that error and then send it to Sentry. Okay, seems like it's done and that it's built. I'm going to go ahead and just pull up Xcode, gonna build it. Shouldn't take too long. You can see this building straight from my phone. And the build has succeeded. So I'm gonna move that out and gonna use my phone, open up the app. And you can see that there's a button up here that is just like, click here for an error. So I'm going to click it. And so just click the error. And let's go head into our Sentry dashboard. So let's try to find some incoming issues that maybe came in the last hour. We can see, oh no, there's a capacitor that came in. It looks like my source maps didn't work. So maybe we can go back and try to figure that out, but I'll actually just show you an error where it did work. I probably just set something else up wrong in the init, but we can see that here, this is my iPhone 12 Pro that came in. Tells you device information about the operating system and the user, information about the event. This is kind of like the stack trace with the lines of code. And if I had made the source maps work properly, but I'll show you an example, you can see kind of the exact line of code that's causing the error. You can also see the breadcrumbs that led up to this error happening. So for example, it seems like I clicked this button twice. So it caused the error to happen twice, but you can see there's a UI click to this Ionic button component. And then there's the error. So probably tells you why that happened. And then we attach a bunch of useful context, things about your app, about the kind of browser web view that was being used, and the device and the operating system. So this is an example of an error that happened in the JavaScript layer. I can also show you something that happens in the native layer. So this is also just from the Capacitor project. And this has happened on an Android device. And you can see here's the Java error. There's like the capacitor bridge, just an illegal argument exception coming from the Java side of things in Android. And we get the same kind of context, breadcrumbs, information about the app, the user, and a whole lot of information about the device that comes in, because just extra stuff that comes from the Android SDK that we use. And so with things like this, you can dig into like the issues that you most care about. We also have performance monitoring, so you can kind of look at how long operations took. In this case, super fast page load for my app I was using, because it's just a demo app. It's the empty Ionic screen that doesn't really show anything. But more complicated apps, ones that are making HTTP requests, loading in components, those can all be instrumented and viewed in our Sentry performance page to make you understand, okay, how fast are my app screen loads and transitions. Finally, we have the ability to kind of walk through releases. You can see that we created this release earlier, 0.1.0, only one error and only one user. That was me who caused it and clicked the button. But this way you can track your releases as you ship it to the App Store or Google Play Store, or you deploy your site for your progressive web app. Over time, how many users are experiencing crashes or how many users are experiencing a good time. And you can also check to see if your release fixed any of your issues. So if your issues come back, we'll mark them as regressions and say, try again, better luck next time. And so that's pretty much a little demo of Sentry and our workflow and just installing it. I think we can bring back the slides.
Yep, I'll go ahead and do that. And I see a couple of people dropping some questions in the chat. Like I mentioned earlier, if you are joining later, we'll have a Q&A session at the end where you can ask any of us questions, whether that's about the AAA app that Nathan's about to go over, Sentry in particular, or me about any Ionic things. So I'm going to go ahead and, where'd my button go? I'm going to reshare my slides. Okay, awesome. And let's go ahead and I'm going to cede control to Nathan and let him talk a little bit about.
I got a little bit more.
So I'm so sorry. Let's go ahead and not give control to Nathan, and I'll give it back to Abhijeet.
Yep, almost done.
My mistake.
So we got the last screen we showed off was the release management for mobile, but wasn't too detailed. If you want to dig in depth into what that looks like and how it can be used, recommend checking out our sandbox. It can be accessed in the link seen in the slide, /demo/sandbox, where you can actually see some live data with like more than just one error and one session, and actually see and try to compare and visualize how your users are using your application. So to wrap it up, ton of benefits of using Sentry with Capacitor. Your errors and unhandled exceptions get automatically captured and sent to Sentry. And you can also choose to explicitly capture errors and messages that you care about. Data from iOS, Android layers just work out of the box, no setup necessary. Performance monitoring also works out of the box. You can see I just added a couple extra lines to my Sentry init to make it to work. And release management makes it easy to track how many users are adopting your release and how many users are experiencing errors with them. And that's basically it from my side. I think we can now take a look at how AAA is using Capacitor and Sentry together to build a great product experience. take it away. I will stop my remote control.
Okay, Nathan, I think you should have control unless oh no, I did take it away from you. Now you can take it away.
Do you mind just sharing me control again? I couldn't actually hit the unmute button as soon as you gave me control. So just try to give me control again, if you don't mind.
Yep. Let's go ahead and try that now.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. And thanks, Abhijeet. That was awesome seeing Sentry. I live in those web consoles, so that's awesome. Before I get into it, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about AAA, like the company and how it's structured, and that will make sense when we move into the next part about how our app is composed and how Ionic and Sentry have been very crucial to helping us face some really difficult challenges. So AAA is most well known for offering their members roadside assistance, custom travel experience, discounts, rewards, and a bunch more. And the interesting thing about, the way that they're structured is they're broken up into clubs. These clubs are like regional, so they're broken up by zip code. And each of these clubs can actually offer their members additional services and products just outside the core what AAA provides. And, due to this, the AAA mobile app, the one AAA mobile app on the App Store needs to reflect this. And so this is where things kind of get interesting. So I'll kind of give you a use case. So, as a user, you're not going to know which club you're part of. You're just a AAA member. So you're going to go to the App Store, download your App Store app, download your AAA app. And the first thing it's going to do is ask you a zip code. Let's say you're from the East Coast, right? You're gonna enter in some zip code, and you might get this app experience. But let's say you're from the West Coast, you might get, this app experience or this other one, right? So there's some magic going on here. How do you have, one app in the App Store with actually multiple club apps? How do each of these clubs give a different experience to their members, right? And we do that with, we partnered early with Ionic, and we use their Ionic deploy, which is usually used to deploy live updates, to actually deploy one native app and have multiple Ionic apps in the application, on one native app. So, which is really cool. So now you've got one app, native app, with serving a bunch of different Ionic apps, which is great until someone from support phones up and says, hey, my login's not working. Or someone writes a review, hey, this is broken, right? Roadside's broken. And, what, we have to, the challenge is who's responsible for fixing that? Because, the interesting thing, like I said, these clubs act as individual units. They can have their own development team, separate of the core, the core team that develops the native app. There's all these other development teams that own different parts of these club apps. So we have to figure out which club the error goes to. And before Sentry, this was extremely difficult to figure out. It was quite the investigation process. But after implementing Sentry and using their custom tags, so what you can actually do is add tags like those, he showed all the, Abhijeet showed all the stuff, data. You can actually add to that with your own custom data, which is awesome. We had club code, zip code, that kind of stuff, that we can actually get a division of where all these errors are coming from, which club it belongs to, which app it belongs to, all this kind of stuff. So we get really detailed division of how all the different apps are doing inside of one native app using Sentry. And it was awesome when we first booted up Sentry. I was showing, it was just so easy to set up. It integrated perfectly, easily. All these unhandled errors was just basically, coming in, and we could just see, where they were in, and we could kind of look at the App Store reviews, look at the support requests, and kind of get a lay of the land how each app was doing. This visibility that we just didn't have before, right? They were just so hard to figure out, who is responsible. So this was awesome for us. This was game changing. And we actually took it even further. I mean, we implemented tags, we looked at the custom errors, but, AAA has some unique things, and we're going to get into that in a second. But I first just want to give you a little history of us with Capacitor and Sentry. So before, I teased that too far. So we moved to Capacitor in the end of 2021. We were super excited when we heard that Ionic was releasing their own hybrid layer. We have a custom plugin a very unique custom plugin in our app, and Capacitors, fit right into that. And again, because we have this distributed system, having complete control of the native layer was fantastic. So Capacitor gives you, really easy to work on the plugins, really easy to work on the native layer. And again, we have the different Ionic apps. So that all worked beautifully. So we were very happy to jump over it. And the bonus was when we moved over, we got to implement Sentry Capacitor, which was a big deal for us because we actually work on all three layers quite often. We work on the native layer, we work on the plugin layer, and then the clubs have their Ionic apps. And the cool thing is when you move to Sentry Capacitor is that it's all the same Sentry instance. It's no more, all the same scope fires. So whenever we fire any event off on any layer, it gives us all the same tags, all the same scope, all the information that we've been tracking. And so that just simplified a lot of things. Rather than trying to recreate it on each layer, we just, boom, Sentry instance. Oh, 1 second. Slide change there. Don't know. Tom, can you go back? For some reason, it's not letting me go back anymore. Oh, I got it. Okay. So, so that was awesome. And again, before, this basically allowed all the layers, all the different layers to fire, and all the unhandled errors go up. And so now we had a really good scope. We actually set up Sentry alerts around what we call key areas. So a big thing for us is login, right? So all the clubs have different login processes. And we're going to get into that a little bit. But the Sentry alerts allow us to respond quickly to any kind of login error. Find out, okay, we see a spike, we go in, we see the login error and we're happening, and we can notify the club before, we start getting support calls and members complaining, bad apps or reviews, all that stuff. So Sentry kind of lets us stay ahead of the game with those alerts, which is awesome. And so we've really liked seeing those come in. So I kind of mentioned, I kind of teased that we do a little bit extra with Sentry. And before I want to get into this, I just want to state again how awesome that web console is. I'm in there quite often, looking at errors, looking at stuff, fixing stuff again, because, we have a distributed development team and different team building different apps. So I'm in there quite often sending stuff out. So it's awesome to use. But the really cool, what we really found out was interesting was you can actually send messages and you can send errors. So your own customer's message, not just the regular, unhandled errors, because there are some errors in our app that, are not fatal, they're not unhandled or fatal, but we want to know when they happen. I kind of alluded to a little bit, and I'm going to jump into it here, is the login process is really interesting because, because you have a distributed app base, everyone has a different login process. And some of these logins actually go through a web view, then hit two APIs, some very complex logins. And the issue with that is that sometimes in that one individual club on that individual login, there's actually multiple development teams involved just in the login process. So when someone phones up and says, hey, I'm this club and I've got a login error, we still don't know who to go to. And that's where we use Sentry to do an interesting thing with, we generated a support code that's shown here on the login error that when users phone up, they end up telling us this error code. And I can punch that error code in and it links to a unique tag on Sentry. And it gives me all the detail. And as Abhijeet showed, you can actually see the previous, all the messages and console that happen. And you can see, I can trace where the error happened. So even if it didn't happen right at the error point, it happened earlier up, I can go up and figure that out and assign it out to the correct development team. So that's one thing that's unique to us. It really helped our login, so that was big. And then the other thing was, I mentioned, that we have, one native app with multiple club apps. And one thing that's unique to us is that, usually get an app boots up, you're good to go. This one, you have to boot an app, enter a zip code, and then load your app. And sometimes users get trapped in the wrong app, or they get stuck in between, somewhere in between that, that zip gate screen where you're in your zip code and the app itself. And we had a lot of users complain about that, but we couldn't see what was going on. Again, not an unhandled error, just something going wrong. And that's when we use the heartbeat service. So its heartbeat service is something we made, but it's basically a service that listens to the state of its configuring. And if that state never gets stuck and it stops sending a signal out to that heartbeat service, we send a custom Sentry event with all that state information into that Sentry event. That's using the additional data field. So we don't tag it, but it's an additional data field. And with all that data, we can really track down where users are getting stuck. And I'll get it a little bit later how we can actually even take that data a little bit further. And another thing that we kind of did was unique to us is that we do security scans. Like apps get security scans all the time. And one of the things that they get scanned on is that unsecured URLs in your app. But because again, we have this really distributed team, and some of all these apps could have different web views. It's kind of hard to track down, is anyone doing having one unsecured URL across, we get flagged for unsecured URL, but we don't know where it is. And so what we've done is use Sentry to basically, is log whenever we get an unsecured URL. And the trick there is that we can interact on the plugin layer, the native layer, or Ionic layer. So it doesn't matter where you're doing this URL, we can send it to Sentry. So that was really cool. And then with all that data, we can make some reports, and I'll get into that in a second. Some cool reports that can be sent out. So that's like some additional things that we've used Sentry for. But again, moving on, I just want to shout out that web console again. That web console is awesome, and we use it daily. But we can also do some pretty other cool things outside that web console. And one of those things is reports. So what you're seeing on screen is a login error report. It's just a generic one. It's a mock one for this presentation. And it's just a piece of the report that we send out. And this report, particular, the one I'm on screen, is about login. And this would be directed at a club to give them a breakdown of how their login is doing. This one report is focused on where the error is happening. So there's a bunch of different errors that can happen in login. And this basically gives them a breakdown of all the different parts that they're happening. And this report in particular shows that the user member info is missing. And that's why when they're logging in, that's why they're failing to log in. Again, this is just an example. But that club could then act on that data. And with this report, not only do we give fancy pie charts for people to present to their execs and distribute to to their development team, and we send it off to the different development teams, so it's nice to present and get them focused on what's happening. We also send a spreadsheet along that gives them detailed reports of those errors. So all of that information, we extract it from Sentry's API and put it into a nice spreadsheet for the different development teams to consume. And this comes in really handy with other things like that heartbeat service, that unsecure URLs. So again, I can go a detailed report about unsecure URLs, and we can even push it up one level higher. So this is on a club level, but we can actually run it on a AAA level. And we could break it into clubs to see who's having the most login issues, to help focus on which club needs the most help and all that kind of stuff, right? So, we have a really good way to monitor all this with Sentry at a really high level and really detailed level down to where the developer can act on it. And that's through Sentry's API and the amazing amount of data they allow you to capture and track within their system. So, we went from being very blind on our production issues to being not only being able to see the production unhandled issues, but also going a step further to seeing the places that we don't want our users to be and getting them out of there. So that's Q&A. So before we go to Q&A, I just want to thank again Ionic and Sentry for having me on. We love the tool. It helps me every day. Instead of my boss coming in and being like, "Hey, I got a login error," and I'm like, "Okay, you got a login error. Let's start the investigation." It's, "Hey, I got a login error. Here's the support code." And I type in 6 characters and I say, "Okay, cool. You got to contact this club and this development team, and this is their issue, and this is what we got to do to get the member in." And that allows our members, our users, to have a better experience. So, thank you guys for having me on. Oh, too many times.
Yeah, I keep accidentally trying to unmute myself and plopping forward in the slides. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, Q&A time. I see the questions have been rolling in during this presentation. So let's go ahead and we'll go through and hopefully answer some questions. Now, where is the Q&A section? There it is, Q&A. Okay, I know you responded to this briefly in the chat, Nathan. But Elizabeth asks, I'm using Firebase, Crashlytics, and monitoring. Does Sentry duplicate or supplement this data? I know you mentioned that the AAA app does both. Can you talk about why you use Sentry so heavily over an alternative tool like Crashlytics?
We actually use both, and it's just historical reasons. We had Crashlytics when we were a pure native app. We later moved into the Ionic when we realized that they could give us multiple apps in one, so solve that problem of trying to get custom club apps. And that's where Firebase, Crashlytics kind of fell short. Like they're still great at what they do. It's just that they can't get into the web layer, right? They're not going to throw unhandled JavaScript exceptions. They're not going to, again, they're Crashlytics, so they're good at crashes, but they're not good at this report. And I know I can put like logs and tags, and they're good at that. So Crashlytics is still great. But Sentry kind of gives us a more full stack approach. And like I was showing that slide earlier where we have the 3 layers, right? We heavily develop on 3 layers. 5 different languages are all pointing to the same Sentry, which is pretty awesome.
Awesome. Let's go down. Jacob has a question that I'm also curious of. If Sentry is not initialized in the JavaScript yet, can it still send error reports from native? And I know you showed this a little bit in your demo, Abhijeet, but could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So at the current moment, we do require Sentry to be initialized, which is why we asked to do it as early as possible in the process. And I showed you an example where I initialized it in the JavaScript layer. And so what we did there was we called Sentry init, and under the hood, it's using Capacitor's plugin systems to do a native bridge to then call initializations to the native layers. So in this are the mobile layers. In this case, iOS or Android, if you're using one of those platforms. And if you're just using, you're deploying to the web browser, you're building a progressive web app, it won't do anything. It'll just rely on the plain JavaScript in it. That doesn't mean, though, that we are dependent on the initialization being called, and anything that happens before then won't be caught. But you can, instrument around this. And we have had actually we have explored this in our mobile SDKs to improve this. So I would actually recommend just like reaching out to us, opening a GitHub issue. We can talk further about it.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add on to your answer, Abhijeet, is that with Capacitor, you're not restricted to only using JavaScript. You can use a native Sentry SDK for Android and iOS if you'd like to initialize there earlier in your app before the JavaScript, like the WebView Capacitor bridge is initialized. You can totally do that with Capacitor because while most of your app logic will be in JavaScript, you still have control over those native layers. And as Nathan mentioned a little bit, when you get to a certain scale or size or architecture of app, you can absolutely dive into as much native code as you need to. So let's go ahead and keep looking at those questions. Let's go ahead. We have so many questions rolling in, and some people are DMing us, so I'm just trying to sift through. Cool. Let's hop into an Ionic question. Are there any extra steps or configurations needed to also deploy to the web? It depends is the answer. By default, Capacitor applications are Android and iOS specific, so a lot of our plugins only have Android or iOS implementations. However, you're just building a web application. So if you don't have a ton of really native features, then you might not need to do anything else, and you could just throw it on a CDN somewhere. All of the official Ionic Capacitor plugins have web implementations. So if you're using official plugins, you'll be fine. A lot of our community plugins also have web implementations. It really depends on your plugin story, but it should be as simple as just running an npm run build or whatever your web build step is, and then putting that up on a CDN. It should still work. There's not any additional processing needed for your web application to function. Cool. Let's hop on back over to Nathan. And we have a high level. Oh, we lost Nathan. So we won't be hopping over to Nathan. Let's see if he joins back in there in a second. But for now, we'll hop on over to Abhijeet. We got a question in the chat. We have several of our own capacitor plugins that we maintain. Will simply installing these Sentry capacitor plugins start reporting errors from those plugins?
So if these are included as part of an application and you add the SDK to that application, yes, of course, we'll catch those errors, whether they happen in the native platform layer or in JavaScript. If these are standalone libraries, though, for example, just like an npm package that you can install to add the capacitor plugin to another app, we actually recommend against adding Sentry to libraries like this, because it could potentially conflict with the application's Sentry instance. And so we don't recommend using Sentry for that use case.
Gotcha. Looks like Nathan is back. He hopped off for a second and now he's back, and that's okay. He was just so scared of answering all of my questions.
No, I'm good. Zoom just kicked me, so I'm ready.
Let's go into a question about the AAA app. Nathan, how does AAA do analytics? I can see the portals in action, but how do you set up your analytics in a federated environment? So I know you mentioned that you're always in the Sentry error panel and you know how to segment these errors, but could you talk a little bit more at a higher level about how AAA specifically segments those Sentry errors?
You're not talking about like analytics, like Google Analytics. You're talking about Sentry errors, right? Just to confirm.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So we can segment it in a bunch of different ways. So Sentry allows you to set scope and set different tags. So what we do is, as soon as you pass that zip gate, like where you enter your zip code, we set the scope on a global level of your zip code and your club code. And then with the club code, it's like a unique thing to the club. We can use that to figure out which club it belongs to. If that makes sense too.
Yeah, that does indeed make sense. Okay, let's pop on back over to a question for Abhijeet at Sentry. Any update on session replay? I've seen a couple people in the chat mention session replay. So any updates you can give us?
Nothing substantial at the moment. This is something that we're actively investigating and working on. And I would actually stay tuned for the end of this year for some possible exciting news.
Thomas, I think you're on mute.
I'm absolutely on mute. Thank you. Let's go ahead and we'll stay in Sentry land a little bit longer. And Abhijeet, can you answer the question? I know we've had a couple comparisons to Firebase, Crashlytics, and Nathan said it's kind of legacy and more native for them. But can you talk a little bit about how Sentry from your side, how does that compare to Crashlytics from the performance dashboard side?
For sure. We have so first of all, you saw it yourself in the demo. We have practically real-time event ingestion, which is not always the case when you use Firebase and Crashlytics. The moment like I kind of threw the error, just had to refresh the page and you saw it in Sentry, and it'll be like this for both errors and performance data. We also put a high emphasis on workflow. So being able to assign to different people, assign to teams, use a link to things like GitHub, so you can take advantage of your Git repos code owners so that you automatically assign incoming errors and issues to the correct folks or teams. And really, the Sentry workflow is like is very important to using it, right? You make sure that the correct people are kind of given the issues that they need to deal with. They apply the fixes. And then you see in the next release if those fixes worked, and then so on, and you keep iterating. And we build a lot of things on top of this workflow also. We integrate with a wide variety of kind of ecosystem partners. You can automatically create GitHub issues, Jira issues. You can send all of your alerts to Slack if you're not a fan of email. And as kind of Nathan mentioned, we expose a ton of this over our API also. So whatever that you can't get out of just the web console or kind of our ecosystem partners, you can build yourself and just get whatever data that you need and do whatever you want with it. And so these are all real Sentry advantages. We make it super easy. And oh yeah, we're also fully open source. So if you really have any questions about this, you can dig into the source code.
Awesome, awesome. Question for Nathan. We have a couple questions about the graphs. How did you create the log and report graph? And how do you do your more granular reports at AAA? Like I know you said you sent data to the clubs themselves. How did you generate that with the API? Is there a way to do it within Sentry? Can you tell us a little bit about how you can make those granular reports?
Yeah, so basically it's like a node script. So you run like any kind of node script, you just run it. And what we do is we pass the configuration file of what we want to get it, whether we break it up by Android, Club, iOS, we just some kind of configuration file of what kind of report we want to run. From there, we basically ping Sentry's API based upon those configuration, pull down all the data. From there, we stream that line data into grouping to what makes sense for whatever the report's asking. So if we're breaking by club or if we're breaking by error or users are affected, whatever it is, then we basically take all that data and put it onto it. We render a HTML page with all those pretty graphs on it, and then we convert that into a PDF. That's how we get the pretty looking reports. Then for the detailed reports, we're basically taking that Sentry data and turning it into more friendly, sometimes more friendly, sometimes we're mapping names out so that people are more clear on what the columns are. And we're basically just turning that into a CSV, right? Basically a spreadsheet. And then you can open it on your favorite spreadsheet editor and check it out, or you can use anything else to import that supports that format, which a lot of tools do. And those PDF and the spreadsheet basically go together, and the report is named whatever kind of the config was set up. So if we ran let's say I run a report for 3 different clubs, it will generate 3 different all reports, and they'll all have their little name, like, club, whatever the club is, what's the club, let's say login errors, and then it will say usually the date run, like usually like last 30 days or something, like the date range, so that they know like this is the range for this report. And then I can just basically send the emails out as I just package those up in a zip or attach them in an email and send them out to the owners, and they can basically go in there, dive in there from there. I usually send it to the higher management, and they usually can show the spreadsheets to their team and then send off the spreadsheets to whoever's actually going to be working on the problems.
Awesome, awesome. So we're coming up to time, so we'll do one more question for Abhijeet on the Sentry side. And we're going to focus on where this question is about privacy. That's a big topic, especially in the mobile space. Apple and Google are constantly locking down and making identifying information harder to get. And let's talk about how Sentry, how do you recommend being transparent to your end users? Is it standard practice to have like a privacy statement or something when you're bug tracking? And how should you offer an option for users to turn on or off these things? I know that's a big topic for a lot of people making any kind of mobile app. And how does Sentry handle this?
So first of all, the Sentry SDK has full controls over like what is sent to a Sentry instance. So any data that you don't want leaving the device that is sent because Sentry captured it or so on, you can control it and say, no, I don't want to send it. So you can kind of in code write out those rules as you need to. And we also kind of provide server-side controls for things like PII to block things that look like credit card numbers or so on. So Sentry kind of has those fail safes there too. I think we generally do recommend being as kind of transparent as possible about the fact that you're using Sentry and that it's for crash reporting and error monitoring, and so it's to help the development experience and to help the app get better. We've seen a ton of our users kind of block the Sentry initialization on a flag so that only after a user consents to it or goes into the settings and turns it on as an option that it's turned on. But most people won't make it required every app start. Instead, it'll be a saved option that is then just later cached on and then used afterwards. In terms of where you need to be kind of explicit about how you're using Sentry, the privacy statement is a great place. Other people have put it into just another part of their settings page. That's what we do actually. We have a Sentry mobile app, and that's what we do there. You can take a variety of approaches. I think it depends a lot on the type of application and the users that are using it.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you, Nathan from AAA and Abhijeet from Sentry for joining me on this webinar. I'm super excited that Sentry is supporting Capacitor as a first-class citizen, and we have an awesome SDK for people to use. Sentry looks like it's awesome, and it looks like a app is using it to great success for a very complex use case. And most of all, thank you to our viewers. Thanks for everyone that joined us today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Ionic or Sentry or AAA if you want. So you can get a hold of Nathan directly. I'm just kidding. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, folks.